Pete, welcome back to Strategy Simplified. Really excited for part 2 of our conversation on the business model of professional sports. Where does this podcast find you today?
I am sitting in Deloitte, New York headquarters at 30 Rockefeller Center. And thanks for having me back.
It's my pleasure. Pete, I have to start here. The last time we connected, it was mid-March, right before March Madness. And we ended up making some Final Four picks that went terribly, horribly wrong. I think much like 99.9% of the other rest of the country. I don't really have an excuse. Just wondering what the heck happened to Purdue.
Yeah. I was more worried. My bigger pick was Indiana on the women's side. So, and they did a little better than Purdue, but not much. Yeah, it was a rough one. So. I feel sorry for the Boilermaker fans out there. Sorry, guys.
So there you have it. Don't take any Final Four prognostications from me or Pete, at least not next year.
I have reams of data that support that conclusion.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Pete, for those of our listeners who missed the first conversation, by the way, we've linked to it in the show notes. If you missed it, go ahead and catch up after this episode. But for those of us who aren't familiar with who you are and your background, can you just give us a 30-second summary?
It's great. Yeah, so Pete Giorgio, again, I'm a partner at Deloitte. I run both our U.S. sports practice as well as our global sports practice. Have a history as a strategy consultant, originally at Monitor Group, which some of you may have heard of from back in the day, but then Deloitte bought that about 10 years ago. So I've been at Deloitte for the past 10 years.
Fantastic. And today, Pete, we're really going to be picking your brain on the business model of professional sports and the marriage of two of my favorite things in the world, business strategy and sports. So as a start, can you just define the market for us? When I say professional sports, what does that mean to you? Are we talking about the leagues, the franchises, both? Can you just expand on that?
Yeah, as we define it, it's I would say the core of, at least we at Deloitte define it, is the leagues. It's the teams, generally the properties, right? So in the sports world, we call them properties. Anybody who has a property that's a sort of sell in the market. It also includes the Olympic movement. So a lot of the organizations, like here in the U.S., the USOPC or the IOC globally, but that extends into national Olympic committees. Also international federations, all of those types of organizations, all the way down to, USA Badminton here in the United States. So it includes all of those. For us, it includes esports, at least the I would say the league and team side of esports, as well as college sports as well. But then, very closely related are the media partners, the ESPNs of the world, where we collaborate with our media practice. The retailers or the consumer products companies of the world, like the Nikes and those sorts of folks, and others as well that are sort of close in as well. So,
absolutely, there's a lot of adjacencies to the professional sports market.
More and more every day. I mean, I do think one of the interesting things about the industry is the convergence, right? And we're seeing that not just in sports, obviously, but across all of media and entertainment.
Now that we've defined some of the players and some of the segments at a high level, would love to just open up the conversation by asking you to dive a little deeper into the forces that you think are really shaping the industry as we see it today. So the way that I think about it is through Porter's 5 forces. And for those of us who may not be familiar, those forces are the threat of new entrants, suppliers, buyers, substitutes, and competitive rivalry. Which of these forces do you think shapes the industry more than others, and how?
I think probably, it's interesting to think about new entrants because, there's a lot of new and emerging sports that are always vying for our attention. And so whether that's, you think about, sort of historically the core, 5 or 6 main sports in the US, but then how do you think about, the rise of some of the combat sports, in the US and globally as well? And so I do think, constantly there is this question of like, what's the new hot sport? What's the next sport that's going to come up? How do sports, one of the biggest determinants actually of somebody who's going to be a fan of a sport is whether or not they played it as a kid, right? And so thinking about where and how youth sports affects that too. and our kids playing more basketball or volleyball or lacrosse or football or badminton or archery or esports, will have huge effects there. And so I do think there's always this question of what are those sports and how will those play out. But also, again, substitutes. Sports is one of the myriad of different ways that fans and consumers sort of engage in entertainment. And so when you have, thinking about plans for Saturday night, are you going to a baseball game? Are you going to go to a movie? You're going to go to a concert? You're going to stay home and watch something on TV? And where and how, sports organizations vie for not just those dollars, but also those eyeballs, right? Because that's actually a lot of what sports does is monetize a lot of those eyeballs that they bring to those sports. So if you think about something interesting like buyers, for me, there is buyers in a bunch of different ways in the sports world. There's obviously the fans and what they are looking for, either in an experience going to a game or what they expect from an app associated with a sport or a team, or where and how they want to buy merchandise. There's also an interesting market for the teams themselves, right? Where and how various people are buying and selling sports organizations in even new and different ways too, is fascinating too. So I do think thinking about the five forces is fascinating, because I do think just about all of those has profound effects on the ecosystem and on the industry itself.
I want to dive a little bit deeper into one of the things that you mentioned, because from the outside looking in, it seems like to me that this is a growing pie. The market is growing rapidly, but at the same time, it's a zero-sum game, because as a league or as a team, I'm fighting for the attention of my fans or of potential fans, and there's only a limited amount of attention to go around. And so if I'm a upstart pickleball league or volleyball league or UFC type of league, how do I start to gain a foothold in Gen Z or even the younger generation, so that 10, 20, 30 years down the line, I've got a rabid fan base? Are you seeing tactics or strategies that leagues are employing to start to bring those younger fans onto their side right now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it is one of the focus areas of a lot of the leagues, but you have to actually back that up even further, because let's take pickleball, great example, right? Obviously, a sport that's had a tremendous amount of growth, especially in the U.S. recently. A lot of press about it. There's different ways to think about that growth. Obviously, a lot more people are playing it. It just seems like more every time I turn around, tennis courts are turning into pickleball courts. You hear that distinctive, wiffle ball type noise of the paddle hitting the ball. It does start with that. It starts with, how do you get people and kids to actually play your sport, right? A lot of the traditional sports that you'll hear about in the U.S., a lot of the U.S. Golf Association, for instance, spends a lot of time thinking about where and how they can get more people to play more golf. A lot of those organizations, and a lot of them are focusing on kids, where and how can we get the next generation to do that? So it kind of starts with getting people to play your sport and be interested in your sport early. But then it's also really about, what do generations of consumers want when they actually engage with the professional version of that sport or the college version of that sport? How do they want to watch it? Do they want to watch it on their phone, on their TV? Do they want to watch a full game? Do they want to watch clips? Do they just care about the betting on the games? Do they just care about the fantasy aspects of the games? And where and how do these organizations meet those consumers where they want to be met, on which platforms they want to actually do that with, as well as importantly, kind of who they want to bring along. Sports continues to be a group exercise, right? Whether you're playing it in many cases, but certainly when you're watching it, it tends to be a group exercise. And so, you got to get people to play the sport in the first place, but you also have to actually adapt the way the sport is supplied to the world in ways that actually meet that next generation. Gone are the old folks like me who, want to just sit in their seat at a game and watch the entire game, right? new generations want to, take advantage of amenities across the stadium, to go visit the fantasy lounge at a stadium, to bring up other games on their phone, to talk to their friends in a restaurant, things like that too. And you're seeing a lot of organizations shift to meet that new demand.
I think one of the starkest examples of that is the rule changes we've seen in Major League Baseball, which I am a big fan of. Cutting the average time of a game down from 3 hours, 20 minutes to 2.5 hours. Even though I'm one of those people that likes to sit in my seat all game and watch the game, it's nice that it goes by faster and keeps my attention.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's been really interesting to sort of watch how that's evolved. And obviously, it's gotten a lot of attention and a lot of praise in terms of how that's happened and the basically the enjoyment that a lot of people have of it. But it's interesting if you attack it from a strategy angle and a business angle, that actually creates some benefits for teams, but also some challenges. Shorter
Absolutely.
games means fewer commercial, means fewer concessions sold, things like that too. So from a business perspective, it is a give get. But I've been taught my entire career, both by clients and by the people who've taught me how to do this, that if you focus on your customers, most other things work themselves out over time.
100%. I'm sure they're thinking about it from a greater lifetime customer value perspective, greater engagement, bringing more people in from the top of the funnel. And even if they're not able to monetize each fan to that same degree, just more fans through the pipeline has to be a good thing, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And again, to your point earlier, younger fans, how do we get that next generation?
So let's talk about then the P&L of a professional sports team. And for me, talking about revenue drivers is always more fun than talking about cost drivers. So let's start there. But what are the biggest levers that franchises pull or properties pull to increase the top line?
And it's fascinating because I think a lot of this, I think people get this once you explain it to them, but sometimes it takes somebody to sort of take an approach. You have to actually approach the teams and the leagues differently on these fronts, right? They actually drive revenue, some places in similar ways, other places in different ways, right? So, most teams' revenue is driven by some combination of sponsorship deals, so local car dealerships or local manufacturers or things like that put a sign in the stadium, buy a suite for the season, run ads on the Jumbotron, things like that, put their name on the field, things like that. That's typically one of the ways. Another way is they typically, in a lot of sports, have a local media deal, right? So this is less so in the NFL, but for a lot of the other leagues, only some of their games are picked up nationally. The rest are made available to the team to sell to a local broadcaster, right? And so that media deal that they have with the local broadcaster would drive a lot of things for the team. Obviously, tickets are usually a big driver at the team level. Interestingly, not as much at the league level. Most leagues are set up such that the ticket revenue is driven by the team. And then the actual situation of the team itself, depends a lot. If they own their stadium, they usually participate in concessions or any of those types of merch and concessions revenue. Whereas if they're just leasing the stadium, sometimes they don't participate in it. But obviously there's some different ways that you could strike those deals. They also, if the team owns the stadium, there's other events in that stadium besides the sporting events, and where and how they drive revenue from other events and other ways that they can monetize their investment there. At the league level, obviously there isn't things like ticket revenue, but obviously sponsorship revenue and especially media deals tend to be much larger at the league level. And so that's where you see a lot of the money coming into the leagues and oftentimes distributed back to the teams as well from the leagues. Interestingly, you at the league level, you're selling bigger sponsorships, national sponsorships, sometimes global sponsorships of those as well. And then oftentimes at the league level, there's international rights. There's broadcast rights internationally or things like that happen too. So I would say similar, but those are typically the places that this revenue comes from for most teams and leagues.
So a big theme I picked up in that answer are kind of media and broadcast rights. And I recently saw that the Las Vegas Golden Knights, so the NHL team, seem to have struck a deal with a broadcast partner where all games within the local region would be broadcast for free, but then nationally broadcast games would be paid for. I'm not sure if I'm getting that right, but can you talk us through if you think that's a model that could become more prevalent here over the next few years? Because it's definitely groundbreaking.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of that deal. I would say in general, this idea of local media rights and where and how teams monetize those and who they monetize them with is undergoing a fair amount of transformation right now. Some of it because of some business drivers, others because of advances in technology. I'd say in general, most properties, and this includes the leagues as well, are trying to figure out where it used to be okay to be able to say, hey, 500,000 or 5 million people watched my game last night. I can't tell you who they are, right? But I know, through various means that many people watched it. More and more, it's not enough to just say that. You need to know who those people are, have other ways to reach them, be able to talk about, statistics about those audiences. And so what you're seeing a lot of properties do is figure out ways to build that one-to-one relationship with fans. And some organizations see some of these media deals as ways or new ways to sort of broadcast and share their content as ways to do that. So I think we're just at the beginning of seeing a bit of a revolution on that front, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Do you think that these one-on-one relationships or these seemingly personalized relationships between me and my favorite team or me and my favorite league, is this really the next big trend in the space?
Yes, I agree. And actually, I'd add to it also you and your favorite athlete, right? More and more athletes are starting to build that one-to-one relationship. Social media has been a boon for athletes to build their personal audiences, right? And build their, one-to-one relationships with fans. So, where and how those relationships evolve, new ways to think about and monetize those relationships, either through existing revenue streams or new revenue streams, is absolutely, a big factor in how sports is going to evolve. It's similar to what happened in, consumer industries, in the grocery industry, in retailers 10, 15 years ago, as they started to adopt things like loyalty programs and got a lot more focused on their customers as well. I think we're seeing the same thing happen in sports.
I, for one, am all for the hyper personalization. I'm there for the increased engagement between me and my favorite team and league and athlete. So I'm looking forward to it. And it's funny how what is now old hat in retail is seen as groundbreaking in a different industry like sports. And it seems like that's just the way the business world works.
That's how business happens.
Right. Innovation in one space is, legacy in another. Well, moving back to the conversation around P&L of professional teams and leagues, how about the boring side of the equation, the cost side? What are some of these biggest drivers that properties are dealing with?
Yeah, I would say at the team level, it's interesting. One of the things I always remind people is that their personnel costs, their salary costs, are structured a little differently than most companies, where a small number of people who get paid get a larger portion than certainly at Deloitte than a lot of folks get. So there's that factor. Beyond that, it depends a little bit on the team situation. Obviously, there's certainly operational costs, and whether that's on the business side, operations around either technology or sales or any of those things. Probably the one that's maybe a little different than most companies is typically there's a pretty high sales component for most teams as they try to monetize, suites and season tickets and things like that. But the rest is usually pretty standard. Most teams are actually not giant organizations. People would be surprised at probably how few employees that their favorite team has. There's certainly another layer of operational costs that have to do with actually the games and the matches themselves, whether that's thinking about prepping the field or coaches or trainers or all of that, and transportation. All of those things are a piece of it as well. But I'd say it's like you said before. It's other than kind of the differential sort of employee type compensation. A lot of it is pretty typical.
I'm going to grossly oversimplify here, so you have to forgive me ahead of time. But it seems like to me there are two ways for just thinking about leagues now instead of teams. Two ways for leagues to continue to grow. And I would think number one, you either increase the ways in which you're monetizing existing properties, so you renegotiate media deals, etc., or you expand your product offering, right? So league or market expansion. Can you give us some insight into how leagues are thinking about this, and if they identify new markets for expansion, how they do that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Like, how do I take my existing assets and either get more for them or sell them to new people, right? And how do I find new products to bring to market, right? I would say on the first one, media rights is a good example. Where and how can I maximize that asset? How do I, one of the interesting strategic questions for a lot of leagues is bundling, right? When I think about doing my media deals, do I bundle in that my digital, which typically happens in most of my digital rights? Do I start to think about data rights? As I start to think about the metaverse, is there a different sort of right that I need to bundle into those deals? And how do I, mix and match and structure those? The NFL has one package for Thursday, a different package for Monday, a different package for red zone, and then splits the other games up in different ways too. So where and how do I bundle those and package those in different ways? And so usually moving those things around and really understanding what both traditional media players, but some of the new media players want is a piece of that. But also new revenue streams. My favorite one is NFTs and what we saw with the NBA and Hot Shots. That was a brand new revenue stream, similar to a historical revenue stream or a traditional revenue stream with a twist on it. But where and how can I find those, right? How do I think about, in some ways you can think about it as a new team, right? That adds games to the schedule. It adds athletes to the mix, all of those things too. And then, what are some new products that I can think about? Where and how do a lot of leagues sort of think about new places where I can license my brand? Who would be interesting in associating a product with my brand and was willing to pay for that in sort of new and different ways. And so I don't think it's terribly different, obviously a little bit more interesting and sometimes sexier than some other industries, but not that different than where and how you think about any company. So
do you think there's a danger for leagues in overexpansion? Is there a danger that I would dilute my product if I'm in 45 markets instead of 30? Or do you think those are overblown fears?
I think you have to be careful, right? I think you don't want to get too far over your skis in sort of doing too much of that. You got to make sure you've got enough. But yeah, I always remind people that, the supply of people who love and are interested in sports is not going away, right? And is in some ways is almost never ending. And so, it's really just a question of, if I'm going to open another team, can I convince people in that city to cheer for that team versus a sport that already exists there, right? Can I think differently about how I structure my conferences or how this works? My favorite, I do think, you talk a little bit about disruptive forces. And I forget if we talked about this last time, but I think it's going to be fascinating to see when the next generation of supersonic travel happens. And you start to get to a world where these leagues could literally play games in other countries, fly to London in a day and back. And it'd be just like, going to LA today, right? And so that's going to open up new things. So I think there's a little bit of a risk and you just got to be careful about it. But listen, I think there's plenty of people out there interested and who love sport. And it's just a question of where and how you bring them to yours.
So the implication, Pete, of what you just said is we may see some consolidation in the space. If I could have an NBA team in Paris, I've got Victor Wembanyama on my team. Why would I be in the French league if I could have an NBA franchise in Paris? Do you think that's where we're heading in the next 30, 50 years?
I mean, I don't know. I think it would be interesting to sort of think about that. Or is there some sort of global different divisions of a league or something. But I think we're absolutely, listen, globalization's real. Globalization's already happening right now in terms of content. And I think we're seeing, the popularity, especially of sports, as for instance, the NBA thinks about expanding to India and to China. So the demand's there. So, I think we could see some interesting things on that front if we could get some of these logistical challenges out of the way.
Absolutely. One of the other value propositions of a team coming to a city or a region, beyond just the unifying effect of fandom and the entertainment value, is the fact that a lot of these teams are involved in community development. They're involved in community investment. There's a big focus on teams and leagues being good community partners. Can you talk to us about some tangible ways that a pro franchise contributes to broader community development? I think the Sacramento Kings are a really good example of this, but I'm sure there are others as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think being involved in the community, giving back to the community, and making a difference in the community that these organizations sit in is it's not just the right thing to do. It's actually demanded by fans and athletes as well. Fans want to. I mean, everything you look at about how buying habits are changing, people are buying products and services from companies that they share values with, that they believe in, that they trust in new and different ways. And the same thing's happening with athletes. Athletes look, more and more athletes are looking to see what other athletes are doing and saying, listen, I need to use my platform to make a difference. And doing that in a local community, whether that be through community organizations or creating direct access, is absolutely a piece of the puzzle. And it's almost table stakes now for any organization that really wants to dive in. And I'm not familiar specifically with what Sacramento's doing, but just about every organization has versions of these programs, both at the team and the athlete and the league level, that are super important.
Pete, one of the things that your practice has done and released recently is a 2023 sports industry outlook. And so we talked about this briefly last time, but we got a lot of follow-up questions around some of the insights and key takeaways that were included in that report. Do you mind just quickly elaborating on some of the potential implications of what your team found and just some insights from that report?
Sure. Anything specific, or just talk more broadly?
I'd love to hear more broadly what some of those insights were, and then we can follow up on what I find most interesting.
I mean, the one that I talk a lot about, and I think is one of the more interesting ones, is we are absolutely seeing women's sports, finally getting the recognition, or start to get the recognition and the attention that it deserves, right? We've been looking at data for years that talks about more people watching women's sports, more people participating in women's sports, more people, wanting to get involved in women's sports. And we haven't necessarily seen some of the dollars that would normally be associated come with that. But people are finally waking up to it. And not in a both in a societal way, like it's important to promote women's sports from a societal standpoint, but also from a business standpoint. I'm a firm believer that women's sports is one of the most undervalued assets that exists in the sports world. And when we talk to our clients, we say to a lot of them, listen, if you're not investing in women's sports right now, you're behind the curve, right? And you're 2-3 years from now, you're going to wish that you had. And so I think we are just at the beginning of that really starting to grow. I think it's going to continue to accelerate. And I think we're going to see a lot more consistent data around the fact that the people who watch this, who are involved in and like women's sports, digging into it. And honestly, we're also seeing interesting emerging data that shows that the people who do choose to watch women's sports and the people who are watching it are more loyal, are more invested in the products that are associated with women's sports. And so for me, the exciting part is, it's not just important for that women's sports be successful, or for for women and girls, it's a business reason. And so that for me is exciting. And I do think it connects to the other one, which I hear a lot about is, the entrance of formal private equity into the sports world in a way, in the US anyway, in a way we haven't seen before. And I think that will be for both women's sports as well as men's sports as well. And so we're seeing organizations come in, buying up minority interests in teams and thinking about those as assets that, have, valuations that grow at a scale that actually outgrows a lot of industries. And so we're seeing a lot of private equity firms and other special purpose vehicles creating dedicated groups that just focus on sports and think about sports as their sort of everyday activity as opposed to an every once in a while activity. So for me, those are fascinating, and it'll be interesting to really see how those grow. I'd also just say that college sports, which was another one of our outlook items, just continues to be a place where there's very few places in sports that are changing as rapidly and as fundamentally as college sports right now. The effect of NIL regulations and the transfer portal and conference realignment and media deals, and what we're seeing on a bunch of different fronts. College sports is going to look very different than it did 2 years from now than it did 2 years ago in ways that even I am having a hard time predict. So,
Pete, there's a lot there to unpack. A couple follow-ups, if you don't mind. Yeah. So one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking is the entrance of private equity into professional sports. Are you seeing these transactions being made, as buy and hold transactions, or do you expect there to be more turnover and ownership the more that we see private equity enter the professional sports landscape?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of buy and hold transactions, at least from what I'm seeing right now. Or at least they're being done without any, there's a bunch of people in that space who are a lot smarter than I who have, long-term plans about what those to do. But, the market is so nascent right now and things are so new that I think you almost have to be ready for a buy and hold type of outlook on it, but also be ready if there are opportunities coming up. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it evolves. There are some folks out there who try to make it even easier to get in and out of teams in ways that I think will be fascinating and maybe even available to folks like you and I at some point here. Although that day may be far in the future, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point here, one of the leagues, allows something similar to what the Green Bay Packers does, but in a more liquid way and a more tradable way. That we're seeing today.
Fractional ownership in a sports team, is that where you think we're heading?
Well, we're there already, right? Most sports teams do have fractional ownership, but what doesn't exist is a liquid market for that. Exactly. So, and I think that might be coming. Again, we've got a bunch of different steps between here and there, but sometime in the future, I think someplace in some league that's going to be a piece of the puzzle.
Personally, I'm looking forward to that day.
Who are you buying? If you could buy a piece of any team right now, who are you buying?
It's so funny. That was going to be my question for you. So if money wasn't an object, I think I'd be in the bidding for Manchester United right now. Personally, I don't think the Brown family would ever sell, but my hometown team is the Bengals, and so I think from a heart perspective, the Bengals are the team I'd love to buy. From a business perspective, Manchester United looks pretty good right now.
Yeah, don't sleep on women's sports though. I'm telling you, that's going to grow exponentially.
What's so funny? I was thinking about this the other day, and talking to a friend, and we had a similar conversation. If you could buy any team in the world, which team would you purchase? And from a purely business perspective, my answer was actually I'd buy a team in the National Women's Soccer League. From a kind of lower barrier to entry perspective, kind of the growth of the market, just the fact that soccer in general is exploding in popularity in the US. I thought the NWSL was pretty attractive. And so it's interesting to hear you talk about women's sports because I'm feeling pretty affirmed right now in my own kind of market analysis.
You can tell your friend that Pete says you were right.
Okay, I love that. That's the whole reason I wanted you to come on the podcast. when you were talking about the NCAA, kind of as a fan looking at the NCAA from the outside looking in, I'm thinking the big winners in conference realignment are the Big Ten and the SEC. Do you see a path for other conferences to compete with those so-called super conferences?
You know, I think the real question is where and how are we? And again, I'll just go back to fans. Where and how do we, do we get to a world where people can continue to watch the football, the basketball, the gymnastics, the track and field, that they want to watch between the teams that they want to see play with each other. And I think customer demand and fan demand and booster demand and even athlete demand will continue to sort of dictate that. So I don't like to talk that much about winners or losers in that space. I like to think about where I think business will naturally drive that market towards something that makes sense to the people who want to watch it and consume it as well. And so, again, we might have some bumps here and there on our way to that, but and whether that means 2 conferences or 10 conferences or 1 conference or a completely different model altogether, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, it's hard to imagine that there won't be some sort of conference structure that'll exist as part of this, but I think importantly is where and how do we meet fans where they want to be met. And I think there's a lot of really smart people in college athletics who get that and will naturally drive the entire ecosystem towards that.
Seems to me that we're just seeing the professionalization of college athletics. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but there are people out there that seem to think that's a negative. You have a comment to make on that?
I'd say professionalism is a very heavy and implication laden word. I would say, generally college sports, in many ways is a business like a lot of businesses. And I think we'll continue to see it sort of grow in the same way we're seeing other sports businesses grow as they sort of learn from those businesses as well. How's that for a non-answer?
Very consulting like of you. Well done.
Yeah. I got to tell you, it's just as a business professional, as a consultant, as a strategist, it's just fast. I mean, we are watching in real time, the realignment of an entire industry in ways that you don't often get to see happen, at the speed we're actually watching this. And it's just fascinating to see how such a complex system, which has a bunch of both real, but also sometimes, invented constraints to it, strain at the edges and evolve over time. And I think we're watching that almost in real time in a way that for me is fascinating. And there's a lot of really smart people in that space. What the NCAA's, starting to talk about and do, what the conferences are doing, what the colleges are doing, what their broadcast partners are doing. A lot of really smart people in that space that I think are going to do some really interesting things moving forward. And I'm fascinated to watch it and hopefully fascinated to be able to help along the way.
Pete, as we wrap up our conversation today, you might remember from last time we end with a couple of personal questions just to get to know you a little bit better. And so I want to turn around your question to me back to you. If you could make an investment or purchase one professional sports team anywhere in the world, which one would it be and why?
Yeah, it definitely would be a women's team, or some other property somewhere. There's a lot of interesting innovations happening in women's sports, just on the notion of a league. Probably something in the women's space. My first love is basketball, so probably something in the basketball world because I feel like I at least know something about that. So probably something in that world would be where I'd personally go. But I think there are a lot of options out there, and yeah, I think it'd probably be in that space. I'm trying to think about, that's the business answer, but I think it's also the personal answer too. So
I love that. Is there an underrated sport that you love, that you follow, that you wish more people knew about?
It's hard for me to. So, I mean, I love most sports generally. There are a couple sports that I'm fascinated by that I actually wanted to go see because there's actually nothing more exciting for me to actually go watch a new sport and see a new sport. When I was just in Australia, I'm not sure if you're familiar primarily in the UK and Australia, they play a game called netball. Have you ever heard of it?
I have.
And it's basically from what I understand, it's basically a version of basketball that emerged when somebody either miscopied or misremembered Naismith's original basketball rules.
There's no backboard, right?
Yeah, no backboard, no dribbling. There's a few things missing. Court sort of split into thirds. And similar to my last trip in Australia, I got to go see an Aussie rules football game. Next time I want to go see a netball match because I'm just fascinated by it.
Amazing. An Aussie rules game is definitely on my list. Next time I'm down in Australia and New Zealand for sure.
Just make sure you go see it with somebody who knows the rules because it takes a little while.
Yeah, it looks like controlled chaos to me when I've seen it. So I definitely need someone to explain it.
Looks like it hurts.
Yeah, that too. Some of the toughest athletes in the world.
Yeah. Not made for 50-year-old sort of former athletes, definitely. So,
Pete, last question for you. If you've been granted, if I was a genie and I could grant you the ability to master any sport right now, which one would you choose and why?
If I could choose a sport to be an expert in and why, you know what I might choose? Just because I find it fascinating is curling. Because it also feels like something that might actually be something that somebody my age could perhaps still be somewhat competitive in. And so, but it also just looks like I've actually tried it a few times. It's a deceptively complex sport. And physical sport in ways that I wasn't expecting, and I don't think most people realize. But it also seems like the people who play it have a lot of fun too, so that appeals to me. So
that's a curveball for sure. I was not expecting that. So I love it. You're keeping us on our toes here. Pete Giorgio is the sports practice leader at Deloitte Consulting. He joins us from Deloitte's offices in New York City. Pete, thanks so much for being with us today.
No worries. Thanks for having me. It's great to see you again. Have a great day.